Awesome. All right. So, welcome everyone. Those of you here present in the room, the faithful remnant, and those of you joining us online. Father Bill is gone again this week. He took advantage of the prodigious snowfall in out west and went skiing. His shall we say, his visit to Our Lady of the Snows. So he is he's enjoying some time on the slopes, and he'll be back next week. He'll actually be back, I think, Saturday. Okay, so this Sunday is Laetare Sunday. Laetare Sunday. The word laetare means rejoice. It's actually, I brought down the Roman Missal just for, a little bit of, this is our old Roman Missal, just for a little bit of show and tell, because every Sunday, a lot of weekdays, every feast has prayers, specific prayers associated with it. This is actually specifically for the fourth Sunday of Lent. And you can see the Roman Missal is always very, shall we say, highly decorated. But the very first prayer in any group of prayers is the entrance antiphon. We usually replace that in Masses with an entrance hymn, although we don't do really much of anything in Lent. But the entrance antiphon for the fourth Sunday of Lent says, "Rejoice, Jerusalem, and all who love her, be joyful. All who were in mourning, exult and be satisfied at her consoling breast." So, Laetare Jerusalem, those are the first two words in Latin of the entrance antiphon, so that's where we get Laetare from, Laetare Sunday. Laetare, yes ma'am, question?
Gaudete Sunday in Advent, doesn't Gaudete also mean rejoice?
Actually, Gaudete means joyful. So they're very similar, but different, slightly different. So, yes, Gaudete Sunday in Advent is the third out of the 4 Sundays of Advent. Remember, Advent is a season of waiting and preparation rather than a season of penitence, as Lent is. So Advent, Gaudete Sunday, reminds us to be joyful because Jesus' incarnation, his birth as a human, is right around the corner. And that's that reminder. Laetare Sunday, I always remember L and L, Laetare and Lent. So Laetare goes in Lent. Laetare Sunday is exactly 21 days before Easter, always, because we have the fourth and fifth Sundays. So Laetare Sunday is the fourth Sunday of Lent. Then we have the fifth Sunday of Lent, Palm Sunday, and then Easter. So it's exactly 21 days before Easter Sunday, and it is. I don't want to say it's not like we suspend Lent, that's not it, but it's a reminder to us that Lent is going to end. You'll notice here at St. Pius, Jeremy's always really good about keeping the seasons and observing them appropriately. So during Lent, we do exactly what the church tells us. The church says it has to be, music should be minimal. So we don't typically have musicians. Or if we do, it's like maybe a flute and a clarinet or a flute and a violin. Very minimal musicians. Minimal decorations. We take all the most of the plants are out, right? Everything's very stark. Keeping with that penitential nature of the season. Laetare Sunday, the church tells us we can do things a little different. We can have more musicians. Matter of fact, even in the Roman Missal, it says, the red rubrics, they call them, because the the type is actually red, but it's their instructions for how we do things. In this Mass, the color violet or rose is used. Instrumental music is permitted, and the altar may be decorated with flowers. Believe it or not, the church tells us what we can do and when we can do it. So when you go to other churches and they don't do what we're doing, they're probably not following what the church says we should do. It also tells us on this Sunday is celebrated the second scrutiny in preparation for the baptism of the catechumens who are to be admitted to the sacrament of Christian initiation at the Easter Vigil, using the proper prayers and intercessions as given below on page 1124. So the church is very, very specific about what we can do and when. So Laetare Sunday is that reminder that our penitential season will end, and although, as always, we must go through the cross to get to the glory of the resurrection will come. And it's kind of a tipping point in Lent. If we have been really good about our Lenten disciplines of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, it's kind of a, hey, you're doing great, keep going. And if you haven't been, it's kind of a reset point. Like, it's okay. You got plenty of time. You got 3 weeks yet. Don't worry about it. Keep going. Start all over again and don't give up. So that's kind of what how that goes. Interestingly enough, for those of you that are Notre Dame-ophiles, which not everybody, I realize we have some Purdue people here too. It's okay. But Notre Dame announces the recipient of each year's Laetare medal on Laetare Sunday. Joan, you probably already knew that. So look for that to come out too. One of the, certainly one of the most prestigious awards to be given to American Catholics, without a doubt. So, all right. So this week, however, just like last week and next week, we've gone to the Gospel of John rather than the regular cycle gospel, because we are preparing people for baptism, Eucharist, and confirmation at the Easter Vigil. So we always do this. We always observe the scrutinies. And the third Sunday of Lent, as we heard last week, is Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well. This week, it's the man born blind, and next week, it's the raising of Lazarus, or as Father Bill put in his homily last Sunday, the way, the truth, and the life, which I've never heard it put quite that way before, so I was quite fascinated by that. It was a great way to put it. Jesus does say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That's in chapter 14 of John. So, you know, we kind of jump through John's gospel here, and then for Father to put it together that way, I thought was quite fascinating. Okay, so this is from the Holy Gospel according to John, and it begins, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. Now, it's important to understand that at this time, not just the Pharisees, but the disciples, all of the Jewish people would have believed strongly that anyone who was blind from birth, he was suffering for the sin of someone before him. Because remember, in Deuteronomy and Exodus is recorded, like Exodus says, Exodus chapter 20, I will visit retribution upon your children and your children's children through the third and fourth generations. And then Deuteronomy says you will be blind and you will suffer. So that would have been well understood that someone, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, someone would have sinned, and this man was paying the price for that person's sin. So who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, and this is really important here, neither he nor his parents sinned. In other words, this isn't God's punishment. Neither he nor his parents sinned. It is so that the works of God might be made visible through him. In other words, his malady, his misfortune is serving a larger purpose. We, meaning all of us, have to do the works of the one who sent me while it is day. The works of the one who sent me, of course, is the will of the Father. And while it is day, and we hear this over and over again through so many Gospels, the bridegroom comes during the day. You know, you walk in the light, not in the darkness. We do our work during the day. We work while it is day. I mean, over and over again, right? Jesus says this. And remember, day or the light are where people encounter God, first of all, where Jesus does his saving work, second of all, and then by extension, where the church does its work. Okay, so daylight. Then he goes on to say, night is coming when no one can work. And he's alluding here to the final judgment. In other words, do what we can while we have the strength and the purpose and we have the light to follow to do it, meaning Jesus, because once we die and we encounter the Lord at our judgment, our time to work is over. So do what we can while we have the light to do it. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. This is one of those I am statements. And any of his listeners would have understood the reference back to the mountain, Moses' encounter with the burning bush. I am. Who shall I say sent me? I am who am. I am. So anybody hearing that would have understood that. I am the light of the world. When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva and smeared the clay on his eyes and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back to see. Remember in Luke's gospel, Jesus goes out into the desert. He comes back. He goes into the synagogue in Nazareth, sits down, gets the great Isaiah scroll and reads, I am sent to bring liberty to captives, sight to the blind, all of that, right? So this is, remember John's gospel was written much later. So this is that fulfillment again, that hearkening back to Isaiah and the work of the Messiah is being fulfilled. Jesus is the Messiah. Now, you can parse this gospel into 7 sections, and that's the end of the first section. So the first section is actually the miracle, or what John refers to in his gospel as signs. There are 7 signs. This happens to be one of them. So that's kind of the sign is the end of the first gospel. Now, I want to just spend a little bit of time here with spat on the ground, made clay with the saliva, all of this. So I think it was St. Athanasius, one of the early church fathers, likened this gospel to preparation for baptism, which is one of the reasons why we use it. But he compared specific things. Being blind from birth, he compared to original sin. Smearing with mud, making the clay, smearing it on the man's eyes, he compared with being anointed with oil at baptism. And then the pool of Siloam being sent as a catechumen. You now have the gift of faith. Now you need to receive baptism. So it's just interesting. That's why, one of the reasons why from ancient times we've used this reading to prepare the catechumens. Jesus as the light of the world, the light, he serves 2 purposes here. Yes, light reveals, and we'll encounter that again in the second reading. So keep that in mind. But light also becomes an occasion of judgment for ourselves. again, we do our work in the light while we're living. We go into darkness upon our death, and then when we encounter the light again, which would be Jesus, that's our judgment. Okay, so just kind of interesting there. Okay. One other thing, this seems so strange to us, these, spitting and very, very material world sort of things. And it's a good reminder to us that John records these things for a reason, that Jesus, it's just another reminder that Jesus became fully human. He was always fully divine, but he became fully human too. He entered into our human nature and did not hesitate to use the things of the world to accomplish his mission. And remember in Genesis, God saw that it was good. Creation is good. It's not something to be avoided. And so these good things can be used to do even better things. Okay, so.
He could have just said, you will see.
Yep, could have just said, yep, you'll see. But all these little details are just buried in here. And when you think about even the early church fathers, like I said, Athanasius was like 4th century. So as early as people that knew disciples, or knew people that knew, like maybe 1 or 2 times removed, actually knew the disciples themselves, they were already making these connections. So this is nothing that we've come up with and, oh, look at this, we're so smart. This has been since the earliest time in the church. So now we go into the second part of this gospel, which is where the questioning begins. Okay, so his neighbors, the man born blind, his neighbors and those who had seen him earlier as a beggar, because what else can a blind man do but beg, said, "Isn't this the one who used to sit and beg?" Some said it is, but others said, no, he just looks like him. That comic relief that John loves to throw in there. And I read in the Word on Fire Bible, I was reading an essay by Bishop Robert Barron, and he said, once we have put on Christ, we are changed in every possible respect. So that, yes, it's comic relief on the one hand, but on the other hand, it also shows that the man born blind's encounter with Jesus has radically and forever changed him. So they said to him, "How were your eyes opened?" He replied, very honestly, matter-of-factly, "The man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and told me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went there and washed and was able to see." And they said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I don't know." So, first of all, think about this logically. The man's blind. He made his way from wherever Jesus was to the pool of Siloam, which right now the whole thing is being unearthed again. We saw, when we were in the Holy Land, we saw part of the excavation. The pool of Siloam was created was built by King Hezekiah in the 7th century to bring water from the Gihon Spring, which was in the Kidron Valley, into the city, so that the city would always have fresh water. And it went through what came to be known as Hezekiah's Tunnel. So I didn't have any good photos of it, which is why I didn't bring photos today, and this gospel's long enough. But that source of water diverted the spring from anyone that would have been putting the city to, that would have been attacking the city or built outside the walls an enemy, and brought fresh water in so that those inhabitants of the city could never have a thirst that was so bad that they'd have to surrender, right? So that's kind of the whole point of the pool of Siloam and how it came to be. So here's this guy who hasn't seen, who was blind, and they ask him where Jesus is. He's like, I mean, imagine this guy's got to be sitting there saying, okay, not only do I not know where he is, I don't even know what he looks like. You know, I was blind. So come on, think this through. Okay, so then we go into part 3 of this gospel, and this is where the Pharisees debate, was the healing a sin because it took place on the Sabbath, or was it a sign? So they brought the one who was once blind to the Pharisees. Now Jesus had made clay and opened his eyes on a Sabbath. And remember, according to Jewish tradition, work on the Sabbath is forbidden. Any sort of work is forbidden. If you own one donkey and that donkey trips and falls down in a deep cistern, you cannot rescue that donkey on a Sabbath. You cannot do any work. You cannot, other than women who have to serve everybody else, like a man did not carry a book on the Sabbath. There was no work, anything considered work, done on the Sabbath. So then the Pharisees also asked him, the man born blind, how he was able to see. He said to them, again, he's got to be thinking, okay, come on, guys, you saw this. Pay attention. He says, he put clay on my eyes and I washed, and now I can see. You can tell a little bit of frustration creeping in there. Not as much detail as the first time around. It's like, okay, come on, guys, I already told you this. Come on. So some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. And what are they doing here but judging by appearance? Okay? And that'll come back in the first reading. Keep that in your head. But other Pharisees said, how can a sinful man do such signs? And there was division among them. So they said to the blind man again, what do you have to say about him since he opened your eyes? He said he is a prophet. So as this controversy swirls around him, he is listening and he's growing in faith. Then we go into the next section of the gospel. And this is really about being in darkness, okay? So, now, the Jews, and remember, they're all Jews. This is just John's way of differentiating the Jewish leadership from the common Jewish person on the street, the disciples, Jesus, even Jesus was a Jew. So, now the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and gained his sight, until they summoned the parents of the one who had gained his sight. They asked them, now listen here, there are 3 questions. Is this your son? Is the first question. Who you say was born blind? Second question. How does he now see? 3 questions. You'll notice too, there are only going to be 2 answers. These people are terrified. That's important. His parents answered and said, we know that this is our son, answer number 1, and that he was born blind, answer number 2. We do not know how he sees now, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Now, again, it's important to understand the context of when this gospel was written versus the events that are being recorded. John is recording events that took place during the life of Jesus. However, he's doing it through the lens of what was happening at the time. John's gospel was the last gospel to be written. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and worship centered around the synagogues by then, not at the temple. And that'll come up here in just a second. But people were threatened that if they were following what was called the way, which was the teachings of Jesus, they were kicked out of the synagogue. And the synagogue was the center of certainly public worship, but also the center of social life, the center of news, everything that was disseminated to people outside the city of Jerusalem. It was done through the synagogues. And so they were terrified. And that's what John is reflecting here. Okay. And what do they say then? Ask him, he is of age. In other words, they're kind of throwing him under the bus. You know, they're terrified and they don't want to be kicked out of their own synagogue. So they put their son into jeopardy to protect themselves. Quite a bit of weakness on the parents' part. None of us as parents could imagine doing that to our kids. We would all jump in front of a bus for our own kids. So we can't even imagine that thought process. But it says here, John tells us, his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone acknowledged him as the Christ, they would be expelled from the synagogue. So that is a crucial piece of information. For this reason, his parents said, he is of age, question him. That is that debate taking place in darkness. Then we go on to the next section of the gospel, which can kind of classify this as sight versus blindness. Okay? So, we're back to the Pharisees. So a second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give God the praise. Now, it's like saying, it's a way of swearing an oath. I swear to God. Okay? Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. Okay? They've made up their minds. They are in darkness. They've made up their minds. He replied, the man born blind replied, if he is a sinner, I do not know. In other words, I'm not falling into that trap. One thing I do know is that I was blind and now I see. Now, it's also important to understand there's no account in the scriptures before this of a person blind from birth that regained his sight. The only record of a person gaining their sight is in the book of Tobit. And Tobit was, a bird pooped on his eyes and he became blind. Disgusting, but true. And then he regained his sight. That's the only miracle of sight being granted to a person or re-granted to a person. But never was there an account in Scripture of someone blind from birth that received their sight. So they said to him, what did he do to you? In other words, they're asking again. They're like, okay, if we ask, maybe we'll get a different answer. We're running out of options. We're getting desperate. We need to hear something different. So they ask him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I told you already and you did not listen. Okay, now he's just flat out frustrated. I told you already and you did not listen. When we hear and we do it ourselves, when we hear something we don't like, we try to find other ways to approach it because we want to get the answer we want, okay? Or maybe we didn't really hear it the first time, or we listened but didn't understand. And we have to put ourselves sort of in the part of the Pharisees in this a little bit, because we can do this. We can be like this. We can't judge the Pharisees too harshly because we're subject to this as well. But the man goes on, why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Imagine how the Pharisees would have reacted to that. The anger, oh my goodness. So what do they respond with? They ridiculed him and said, you are that man's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. They are distancing themselves here. Remember, Moses was the giver of the law. The Pharisees felt that absolute, complete, and perfect observance of the law is what was going to get them to paradise. So they considered themselves disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, recorded in the scriptures, obviously, but we do not know where this one is from. The man answered and said to them, "This is what is so amazing, that you do not know where he is from, yet he opened my eyes." Then he's going on to school the Pharisees here, right? We know that God does not listen to sinners. Well, okay. We're not going to go that far. Remember, this was at a time of an honor and shame society. And sinners were shamed, so their prayers were considered less important by the Jewish leadership, certainly by the Pharisees. But we know that God does not listen to sinners. We know he does now. He's always listened to sinners. It's just how this is recorded, so it makes sense to them, and it makes sense in that law-driven honor-shame society. But if one is devout and does his will, he listens to him. It is unheard of that anyone ever opened the eyes of a person born blind. Again, no recording in the scriptures. If this man were not from God, he would not be able to do anything. Think about that. It goes back to that basic question, do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God or not? And that's a question that each and every one of us has to answer for ourselves. But if Jesus isn't the Son of God, he's a very bad man. And he's lied over and over again. But if you do believe he's the Son of God, then we have to follow him and change our lives. So, but remember, they're in darkness. The Pharisees themselves are in darkness. So what is their response to him? They answered and said to him, "You were born totally in sin." That idea coming out of Exodus and Deuteronomy. And you are trying to teach us? They are completely and totally skeptical. They feel nothing but exasperation and contempt for this guy. There's nothing he can teach them. And so what do? Then they threw him out. When we don't like what we hear, discard it. Yes, out. You're out of here. Now we go into the next section. This is, let's call this the verdict. Okay? All right. When Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, the man born blind, he found him and said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Now, the Son of Man, that particular phrase comes from a couple different places. The prophet Ezekiel referred to himself over and over again as the Son of Man, reminding the people that he was speaking for God. It's also in the book of Daniel, when Daniel describes the Messiah. He describes him as the Son of Man, meaning God's eventual presence in the flesh. So, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered and said, "Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Now remember, this guy didn't actually see Jesus. Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? His heart is open. He's ready. He's ready to believe. He has been given, he is a catechumen. He has been given the gift of faith, and he is waiting for that fulfillment of the sacraments, okay? Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." What is his response to that? He said, "I do believe, Lord." And he worshiped him. He was ready. Like I said, his heart was open. All he needed to do was know which way to turn to accept that gift of faith and worship. And that's what he does. So that is the result, the eventual result of that sign, that miracle, is he's encountered the Lord, and he acknowledges him as Lord and worships. It was St. Thomas Aquinas that said that the man born blind can be, once he's received his gift of sight, that he can be most closely equated with a catechumen, and that the fullness of sight is not just the physical ability to be able to see colors and shapes and people and things, but it's also the spiritual sight, the ability to recognize the Lord and give him worship, to see with the eyes of faith. That's St. Paul. I'm mixing my people here, but I love that phrase. Now we're into the last section, which is we're back in darkness. Then Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see might see. In other words, those who do not see with the eyes of faith, those who do not have the fullness of spiritual sight, might see and receive Jesus and worship him. And those who do see might become blind. Those who think they already know the answers, those who feel that the only way to get to heaven is through that perfect observance of the law, that everything else is immaterial. In other words, the Pharisees certainly is who he's calling out here, but truly anyone who rejects Jesus. Those who do see might become blind. Their spiritual sight will rule everything. Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this and said to him, surely we are not also blind, are we? The fact that they can ask that should throw up a red flag even for them. Jesus said to them, if you were blind, if you recognize your need for me as the Lord, if you recognize your need for Jesus, you would have no sin. You would not be separated from God. Remember, that's what sin is, separation from God. You would not be separated from God. You would have no sin. But now you are saying we see, we think we see, so your sin remains. In other words, you've turned your back on me. You've turned your back on my Father. To you, what's more important is that absolute observance of the law rather than having a personal relationship with me, with the Holy Spirit, with the Father. So, yeah, it's a long reading and it's a lot packed in there. But this really helps us realize that it's important to determine those who are willing to accept Jesus and accept the gift of faith, and those who wish to reject it. Yes, Carol.
Is it significant that the Pharisees went to the temple, and yet some of the Pharisees went with him?
It is significant because remember, there are always Pharisees. And that earlier line, there was division among them. That stays with them throughout the life of Jesus. Because even when they were after Jesus' next sign, which will be the raising of Lazarus, there was still division. There were still those who thought, you know what, we can't be standing in the way of this. There were still those who thought, this man's a sinner. Even Gamaliel, who was a very well-known rabbi, he was a Pharisee, it's recorded in Acts that he said, listen, if we fight against this, and this was after Jesus' death, if we fight this, we could be fighting God. So there's always there's always division among the Pharisees, Because remember, their ultimate goal is to get to heaven. They think that the best way to do that is by keeping the law, but there are some that were open to realizing that, the law may not be the only thing we need. Because even in Jewish lore, every time in a synagogue service, they read from the law, then they read from the prophets. So it can't be just the law. Law, the prophets, the writings, or the Old Testament, types, or the Jewish Bible, types of the Jewish Bible, types of writings. So there are those that realized, Nicodemus, who came and saw Jesus when? At night. He was in darkness, but he's still searching for the light. So that there's always, the Gospels record that there's always division amongst the Pharisees. And always there is an openness in some to be followers of Jesus. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? I know it's a really long gospel. Okay. Okay. So let's go to the first reading. The first reading here is from the first book of Samuel. We're in chapter 16 here. Samuel was the last of the judges. And Samuel was very hurt, unhappy, angry when the people rejected the judges who had been ruling over the people, the Jewish people. And they asked for a king. They wanted a king. We want to be like everybody else. We want a king. And so Samuel was angry. He went to God and said, they've rejected me. God said, no. They haven't rejected you. They've rejected me. But we'll go ahead. We'll give them what they want. So in chapter 9 of the first book of Samuel, Samuel describes Saul's choosing and anoints him first king, right? So we're all good there. But Saul has grown in the intervening chapters. How do we describe this? A lot more self-centered and a lot less devoted to God. And the Father is looking at Saul saying, this is not the person that should be leading my people. So Samuel was not only the last judge, he's also a prophet who speaks for God. So God speaks to him. And that's where our reading begins now. The Lord said to Samuel, okay, we're going to set up a pretense here. I need you to do something for me, and this is going to be your pretense to go do it. Fill your horn with oil, because kings were anointed, and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. Think here of the Advent reading, and you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, least of all the tribes. So, unimportant. For I have chosen my king from among his sons. Remember, God the Father was the ultimate leader of the Jewish people, and whoever he designated, whether it be a judge, whether it be a prophet, whether it be a king, it was his choice as to who would be the leader. So the whole idea here is Samuel is going for a banquet, a sacrifice, and that's the pretense for going there, so they don't alert Saul, who they know will do something bad, which he does. He goes after David, but just so that there's no problem in the intervening time, we're going to go. This is going to be your pretense. You're going for a banquet. So, as Jesse and his sons came to the sacrifice, to the banquet, Samuel looked at Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is here before me. Tall, good-looking, strong, right? Judging by appearances. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not judge from his appearance or from his lofty stature, because I have rejected him. Not as man sees does God see, because man sees the appearance, but the Lord looks into the heart. In the same way, Jesse presented 7 sons before Samuel. Now, you'll notice there's a number of verses that have been cut out of this. If you actually go and read 1 Samuel, it tells about every single son that gets marched in here. Okay, this just makes it simpler. All the kids were brought in. But Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any one of these." Then Samuel asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" In other words, come on now. Everybody's supposed to be here at the banquet. Why has the Lord not chosen somebody out of here? What are you hiding? Jesse replied, "There is still the youngest, who is doing what? Tending the sheep." Yes, that's a huge metaphor in the Old Testament for taking care of the people, tending the sheep. So that's where we first encounter David, right? Who is tending the sheep. Samuel said to Jesse, "Send for him. We will not begin the sacrificial banquet until he arrives here." Jesse sent and had the young man brought to them. So sends a servant to go take care of the sheep in the meantime, and David comes. Now, I think it's so funny that the scripture tells us, not as man sees does God see. And then what do they do but describe him? He was ruddy, meaning healthy and rosy-cheeked. He was ruddy, a youth, handsome to behold, and making a splendid appearance. Okay, we're judging as humans do by that outer appearance. Okay. The Lord said, however, "There, anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel, with the horn of oil in his hand, anointed David in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David. Remember, when a king was anointed, that anointing itself was a symbol of the fact that the Spirit of the Lord was with him. We hold on to that in baptism, right? That's one of the reasons that we anoint with chrism. So, the Spirit of the Lord left Saul and came to reside with David. I'm not sure that Saul would have been spiritually at a point that he would have even noticed, to be honest. If you go and read Samuel and you read how bad Saul had become at this point, it's really hard to say, but scriptures tell us that the Spirit of the Lord leaves Saul and rushed upon David. Interestingly enough, this is Samuel's last act as a prophet. And after this, he retires to a city called Ramah, and he's essentially not heard from again. So this is his last act, official act as a prophet. This is important here, of course, because the house of David is seen in Jewish tradition as the greatest of all the kings of the kingdom of Israel. That he was the best leader. He was, many of the Psalms are attributed to him. Certainly 1 through 51, Psalms 1 through 51 are attributed to him directly. And he certainly had his share of problems, sins. You know, Psalm 51 is his great psalm of penance, right? Of acknowledging that his actions were bad. And it's the prophet Nathan that calls him out on it. So that's way down the line. But it's important too because Jesus comes from the house of David. And that's, you know, we hear again in Advent, a shoot from the stump of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David. And so we hear that in Advent, the reminder that that's going to be the house of David. And Jesus is a descendant of the house of David, which was the promise that the Messiah would be of the house of David. All right. Questions, comments, thoughts, ideas? The psalm this week is Psalm 23, which of course is "The Lord is my shepherd." Perfect psalm to accompany the first reading. And then the second reading here is from the letter, St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and this just pairs so well with the gospel. Brothers and sisters, you were once in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. And again, that idea of darkness is unbelief and light is faith and belief. Live as children of light, for light produces every kind of goodness and righteousness and truth. Try to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the fruitless works of darkness, sin. Rather expose them, for it is shameful even to mention the things done by them in secret. That's why in the sacrament of reconciliation, it's so important. It goes on to say, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for everything that becomes visible is light. It's so important for us to go into the confessional, to encounter the Lord in the sacrament and acknowledge our bad deeds, our sins, the times we've strayed from the right path, the times we have not kept our baptismal promises. So important for us to go into the sacrament of confession and acknowledge what we've done and our need for God's mercy. And that whole idea, everything exposed by the light becomes visible, that's that process of conversion. Continual process of conversion, and we have to do that throughout our lives. It's not a one and done, as we all know. It's not a one and done. Therefore it says, and this is a baptismal hymn, this harkens back to chapter 60 of Isaiah, awake, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. The Messiah, it's Christos. They're not, Isaiah isn't specifically referring to Jesus, but the Messiah, the light will come. And of course, light in here is, remember in chapter 8 of John, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Light is a metaphor for God in his kingdom, and darkness is a reminder that we are resisting God's invitation. And this, you can see why this pairs so well with the gospel, that light and dark. Questions, comments, thoughts?
I almost wish on Sunday morning that we would hear the gospel first.
I know.
Because then these other ones make sense.
It makes more...
Hear them first and go, oh yeah, okay, I get that. The gospel. And there's so much detail in it that you go, oh, do I remember that's probably why they put these readings here? You know, it's just how it's presented here. It just makes sense to go back and go, oh yeah, I get that, why that's there. But in church on a Sunday, or Sunday, whatever
day of the
Mass,
week, yeah.
right. To hear this first and go, oh yeah, I remember that's how David was called. Right. Oh, lightness, dark. Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
And we're reading about blindness and darkness and back and forth. And like, this has got the meat, and we're getting the appetizer, but we don't know why it goes with the meat.
Yeah, well, actually, that's a really good point. Yeah, that is a really good point. And that's, I think, really the biggest advantage of doing a Bible study every week and looking at the upcoming readings, because it does give you a chance to parse it out and make those connections. And then you'll remember it when you hear it on Sunday. But when you hear it in order, you don't always make those connections, even between, like the first reading in the Psalm. Where was David? Tending the sheep. The Lord is my shepherd. We don't always make the connections, even though we should, even though we hear them year after year after year. We don't always make the connections, but that's what the homily's for. That's their job. Make those connections for us. Yes, Carol.
Thank you for continuing to live stream this, because although we were in Florida last week, I did
Oh.
attend Bible study via live stream.
Well, good. Well,
And I enjoyed it.
good. I'm glad. I'm happy. I've actually had a bunch of people tell me that they aren't able to be here. They either work or they have other things that they do on Thursday mornings. And so, like so many things, when we actually live stream it, Jimmy, you could probably tell me more than anybody else. We usually only have a small group of people that live stream at the time, but like at the end of a week, we have like,
Some of these will hit 1,000, 1,500 viewers.
yeah, I mean, it's crazy. So when you think of that, and thanks to Jimmy for this amazing job that he does of getting that out there on the web, but that gives us an opportunity to reach so many more people. And so hopefully people are getting that where they're making those connections. And so then when they go to Mass on Sunday, they're like, oh, that's what they were talking about. So
That's why we do it, and we're happy to.
we are happy. Yes, that is why we do it, and we are happy to. So thank you all for staying through this long gospel. As I said, I am convinced that the church is preparing us for Palm Sunday, where we heard two gospels, and then the Easter Vigil, where we sit for like an hour and just listen to scripture. But that's okay. You know what? It's great, and it's certainly one of my favorite of the entire liturgical year, one of my favorite masses. So all of Holy Week.